The stars were so bright that night in 1955 that young Robert Morningstar could see his own shadow cast by starlight alone. He lay on his back in the prairie grass of the Pine Ridge Reservation, his grandfather beside him, both staring up at the Milky Way stretched across the South Dakota sky like a river of light. "See there," his grandfather whispered, pointing at a cluster of stars. "The 7 stars, the Pleiades. We call them the lost children. In 2 moons, when those stars rise before dawn, that's when we plant corn. The stars tell us when. They've been telling us for thousands of years." Robert, 12 years old and already fascinated by the night sky, tried to memorize the position of every constellation his grandfather showed him. The Big Dipper, which the Lakota called the Great Bear. The morning star Venus, the scout who announced the sun's arrival. Orion's belt, the 3 chiefs walking in line. Each star pattern had a name, a story, and a purpose. The sky wasn't just beautiful, it was a calendar, a compass, a library, a sacred text written in light. "The white man looks at the stars and sees burning gas," his grandfather said. "We look at the same stars and see our ancestors, our history, our future. We see when to plant and when to harvest. We see which way is north when we're lost. We see the road our spirits will walk when we die. The stars aren't just up there. They're part of us, and we're part of them." What neither Robert nor his grandfather could know that summer night in 1955 was that they were living in one of the last moments when this ancient knowledge could be fully practiced and transmitted. Within 2 decades, the night sky would begin to disappear, not the stars themselves, but humanity's ability to see them. Light pollution from growing towns and cities would wash out all but the brightest stars. The intricate stellar knowledge that had guided native peoples for millennia would become impossible to teach because the classroom itself, the night sky, would be erased. Native American astronomical knowledge was far more sophisticated than most people realize. It wasn't primitive stargazing or simple mythology. It was a complex science developed over thousands of years of careful observation, passed down through generations of specialists who devoted their lives to studying the heavens. Different tribes had different focuses. Some tracked planets, some specialized in eclipses, some used stars for navigation, some aligned their ceremonies and architecture to celestial events. But all of them understood that the sky was dynamic, predictable, and essential to life on Earth. The Pawnee of Nebraska had perhaps the most elaborate star knowledge of any North American tribe. They were known as the Star People because astronomy was central to their entire culture. Pawnee priests could predict eclipses. They tracked the movements of Venus and Mars. They knew that Earth was round and understood the concept of the celestial sphere. Their villages were laid out according to star positions. Their sacred bundles were associated with specific stars and constellations. Their ceremonies were timed to celestial events with precision. Frank White, a Pawnee elder and astronomer, tried to explain this to a researcher in 1970. "Our priests spent their whole lives studying the stars. They could tell you exactly when Venus would appear, when an eclipse would happen, when the solstice would occur. They had charts not written, but memorized going back generations. They knew things that white astronomers only figured out with telescopes and mathematics. But they learned it through observation, night after night, year after year, elder teaching younger, for hundreds of years." But by 1970, when Frank gave that interview, he was one of only a handful of Pawnee people who still possessed this detailed astronomical knowledge. The younger generation wasn't learning. It wasn't just that they weren't interested, though many weren't. It was that the conditions for learning had changed. In earlier times, a young person learning star knowledge would spend years observing the night sky with an elder, learning to recognize subtle changes in stellar positions, memorizing the rising and setting points of key stars throughout the year, understanding the complex relationships between celestial movements and earthly seasons. But by the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, this kind of patient, long-term observation was becoming impossible in many places. Electric lights on reservations, In nearby towns, along highways were making the fainter stars invisible. Young people couldn't see what they were supposed to be learning. The sky that had been the textbook for thousands of years was being erased, one electric light at a time. The Lakota people of the plains had their own sophisticated star knowledge, intimately connected to their ceremonies and way of life. The constellation Wiching Chala Shakowiying, the 7 little girls, known to non-natives as the Pleiades, was particularly important. The Lakota used the rising and setting of this constellation to mark the beginning and end of different seasonal activities. When the Pleiades rose in the east before dawn in spring, it was time for the sun dance preparation. When they set in the evening in fall, winter activities began. The morning star ceremony was another crucial astronomical observance. Venus, the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, was carefully watched. Its appearance as morning star versus evening star marked different ceremonial times. The Lakota understood that the morning star and evening star were the same object, Venus, something that many ancient cultures struggled to figure out. They tracked its movements with precision, knowing that its cycles repeated every 584 days. Agnes Black Elk, a Lakota elder and keeper of star knowledge, watched this tradition fading in the 1,970 seconds with profound sadness. My grandfather knew every star, every planet, every sign, she said in a 1978 interview. He could look at the sky and tell you what time it was, what season it was, what ceremonies needed to be done. He tried to teach me, and I learned some. But I couldn't teach my children and grandchildren the same way because they can't see the stars like I could when I was young. The sky is washed out with all the lights. And even when we go away from the lights, they're not interested. They can check the weather on TV. They can look at the clock to tell time. They don't understand that star knowledge is about more than that. It's about being connected to the universe, about understanding your place in creation. The Hopi people of Arizona incorporated star knowledge into their ceremonial calendar and agricultural practices. They observed the solstices with great precision, using natural landmarks and architectural alignments to mark the exact days. The rising and setting points of the sun throughout the year told them when to plant different crops. The stars, too, played their role. Certain star clusters rising at dawn signaled specific planting times. But Hopi astronomical knowledge was more than practical. It was deeply spiritual. The stars were living beings, ancestors who had ascended to the sky. The Milky Way was the path souls traveled. Specific stars were associated with Katsinam sacred beings who brought blessings to the people. To lose star knowledge wasn't just to lose agricultural timing. It was to lose connection with the sacred cosmos. Thomas Baniasia, a Hopi elder, spoke about this loss in 1974. The young people grow up in houses with electric lights. They go to bed with lights on. They don't go outside at night and look at the stars like we used to. They don't learn to recognize the star patterns, don't learn the star stories. The knowledge is in a few old people's minds, but when we die, if we haven't taught it, it's gone forever. And you can't teach star knowledge in a classroom with pictures. You have to be under the stars, night after night, watching them move, learning to read them like we learned to read the land. The Chumash people of California had created star ceilings in their ceremonial caves, complex astronomical murals painted on rock that showed constellations, planets, and astronomical events. Recent research has shown that these weren't just pretty pictures, but functional star charts and calendars. The Chumash understood solstices and equinoxes, tracked lunar cycles, and possibly even recorded supernovae and comets. But this knowledge had largely been lost even before the 20th century, destroyed by Spanish colonization and mission system that forcibly removed Chumash people from their lands and prohibited their ceremonies. By the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, only fragments remained in the memories of a few elders. There were no longer practicing Chumash astronomers who could explain the full meaning of the cave paintings. The sophisticated astronomical science had been reduced to folk tales and partial memories. The Navajo people had their own star knowledge, particularly focused on constellations and their stories. Black god Hush-Lt was the deity associated with the stars. According to Navajo tradition, he placed the stars in the sky, creating the constellations that would guide the people. The North Star Nahux was particularly important for navigation. The Pleiades Diliahe marked seasonal transitions. The Milky Way Yikaistaha was seen as the path of the spirits. Navajo star knowledge was taught through stories, songs, and direct observation. A child learning the stars would sit with elders on clear nights, learning to identify constellations, hearing the stories associated with them, understanding their practical and spiritual significance. The process took years. It required a dark sky, patient teachers, and interested learners. By the 1,970 seconds, all three requirements were becoming scarce. The skies above the Navajo Nation were no longer completely dark lights from border towns, from the coal-fired power plant at Page, from highway traffic, all contributed to sky glow. The elders who knew the complete star knowledge were aging and dying. And young people, educated in Western schools, often saw traditional star knowledge as superstition or outdated information, less useful than modern astronomy. Yet traditional native star knowledge and modern astronomy weren't contradictory, they were different approaches to understanding the same phenomena. Many elders who learned star knowledge from their grandparents and then studied Western astronomy found that their ancestors had been remarkably accurate in their observations and predictions. They had simply used different frameworks to organize and explain what they saw. The difference was that Western astronomy was about objective scientific knowledge, while native star knowledge was about relationship. Modern astronomy asks, what is that object? Native astronomy asks, what is my relationship with that being? Both provide truth, but different kinds of truth. And when native star knowledge was lost, it wasn't just data that disappeared. It was a way of being in the world, a sense of connection to the cosmos, a framework for understanding humanity's place in the universe. The architecture of many Native American structures shows sophisticated astronomical understanding. The medicine wheels of the plains, the great houses of Chaco Canyon, the pyramids of the Southwest, many were aligned to solstices, equinoxes, or specific star risings. This wasn't accidental. It required precise knowledge of celestial movements and considerable engineering skill to encode that knowledge into stone structures that would mark astronomical events for centuries. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the ancient Puebloan people built structures with windows and doorways aligned to solstices and the lunar standstill cycle, a 18.6-year cycle of the moon's rising and setting positions. They carved spiral petroglyphs that functioned as solar calendars. They oriented their great houses to the cardinal directions with impressive accuracy. This level of astronomical sophistication required generations of careful observation and mathematical understanding. But by the 20th century, the knowledge of how to read these ancient sky markers had been largely lost. Archaeoastronomers, modern scientists studying ancient astronomical practices, have had to reverse engineer the knowledge that ancestral Puebloans possessed. The descendants of those ancient astronomers often couldn't explain the astronomical functions of the structures their ancestors built, because that specific knowledge hadn't been transmitted through the disruption of colonization and forced cultural change. Solar eclipses were understood and often predicted by various tribes. The sudden darkening of the sun, an event that caused panic in many cultures, was expected and explained in Native American traditions. Different tribes had different interpretations and responses. Some saw eclipses as dangerous times, requiring ceremony. Others saw them as natural, if ominous, events. But many were not surprised by them because their sky watchers had learned to predict them through careful tracking of lunar and solar cycles. Lunar eclipses, more frequent and less dramatic than solar eclipses, were also tracked and interpreted. The moon's changing phases were used for calendrical purposes by many tribes. Some tribes counted time by moons, lunar months, rather than solar years. The women's cycles, agricultural cycles, and ceremonial cycles were all tied to lunar phases in various native cultures. The planets, those wandering stars that don't stay in fixed constellations, were tracked by knowledgeable observers. Venus, brightest of the planets, was most important to most tribes. Mars, with its reddish color and varying brightness, was also noted. Jupiter and Saturn, bright but slower moving, were recognized by some. Mercury, difficult to see, was known to the most skilled observers. The knowledge of planetary movements was specialized information, held by astronomical priests or elders who dedicated themselves to skywatching. One of the tragedies of the loss of native astronomical knowledge is that we don't fully know what was lost. Because the knowledge was oral, transmitted through teaching and memorization rather than written down. When a knowledgeable person died without having fully taught the next generation, their knowledge died with them. We have fragments, stories collected by anthropologists, partial information remembered by descendants, alignments evident in ancient structures, but the complete systems of knowledge, in many cases, are gone. Some native communities have made efforts to revive and preserve star knowledge. The Pawnee have worked to document what remains of their astronomical traditions. Some Lakota communities are teaching star knowledge to young people, taking them to dark sky locations where they can actually see the stars they're learning about. Hopi farmers are relearning traditional astronomical timing for planting, but it's difficult to revive something that requires constant observation over years. You can't learn to read the stars from a book or a video. You have to be under them, night after night, which is precisely what modern life makes difficult. Dark sky parks and preserves have been created in some locations, including some on or near native lands. These are areas where outdoor lighting is controlled or eliminated to preserve naturally dark skies. They're valuable for astronomical observation, and for environmental reasons, many animals and plants are harmed by light pollution. For native communities near these dark sky areas, they also represent a chance to practice and transmit star knowledge again, to see the sky as it looked when that knowledge was developed. But dark sky areas are rare and getting rarer. Light pollution is increasing globally. Satellites are crowding the sky, thousands of them now, with tens of thousands more planned. These satellites reflect sunlight, creating artificial stars that move across the sky, further disrupting the natural celestial view. The sky that native ancestors knew, that held the star patterns they memorized and the stories they told, is disappearing not just from the reservations but from the entire planet. Robert Morningstar, the boy who lay under the stars with his grandfather in 1955, is now an old man himself. He lives in Rapid City, South Dakota, where the sky glow from city lights makes it impossible to see more than a few dozen stars on even the clearest night. He's tried to teach his grandchildren the star knowledge his grandfather taught him, but it's nearly impossible. They can't see what he's talking about. The lost children, the Pleiades, are lost indeed, drowned in light pollution. I take them out to the country, away from the city lights, Robert said in a 2015 interview, now 62 years old. And even there, it's not like it was. We can see more stars than in town, yes, but not like when I was young. The sky was full, absolutely full of stars. The Milky Way was so bright it cast shadows. Now, even in the country, it's a pale thing. And my grandchildren, they look at the sky for a few minutes and they're done. They don't have the patience to watch, to really learn. They're used to instant information on their phones. Learning the stars takes time, takes nights and nights of watching. That kind of learning doesn't fit the modern world. But Robert hasn't given up. He's working with the tribal college on the Pine Ridge Reservation to create a star knowledge program. They've identified several locations on the reservation where the skies are still relatively dark. They're bringing elders and young people together for star watching sessions, trying to transmit what's left of the old knowledge before it's gone completely. They've documented the Lakota star stories, creating recordings and written materials not as a replacement for the oral tradition, but as a backup, a safety net to preserve what they can. They face an uphill battle. Young people are busy with school, work, and modern life. The elders who know the most are aging. the skies continue to get brighter. And there's the fundamental challenge that star knowledge isn't just information. It's a practice, a way of being, a relationship with the cosmos that requires you to slow down, be patient, and spend time in the darkness, which runs counter to everything modern culture values. Yet there's something stirring, a growing interest in traditional knowledge among some native young people. Climate change, environmental destruction, and the spiritual emptiness of modern consumer culture have led some to seek wisdom in the old ways. Star knowledge is part of that. Learning to read the sky, to feel connected to the cosmos, to understand your place in the universe through the stars. These things answer needs that modern culture doesn't address. Native American star knowledge isn't just history or nostalgia. It's a living tradition where it's still practiced, and it can be revived where it's been dormant. It offers something that modern astronomy, for all its technical sophistication, doesn't provide. A way of seeing yourself as part of the sky, connected to the stars not just as distant objects, but as relatives, guides, and companions on the journey of life. On clear nights at Pine Ridge, when the moon is down and the sky is as dark as it can be in the 21st century, Robert Morningstar still goes outside to look at the stars. He thinks of his grandfather, gone now for 40 years, and the perfect star-filled sky of his childhood. He looks for the Pleiades, for the morning star, for the Great Bear. He remembers the stories, the teachings, the sense of connection to something vast and eternal. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes a young person joins him. They lie on their backs in the grass, as Robert and his grandfather did 60 years before. Robert points out the constellations he knows, tells the stories he remembers. The young person asks questions. They watch the stars slowly wheel across the sky. For a few hours, the old tradition lives again. The thread isn't broken. It's thin, worn by the passage through difficult years and light-polluted skies, but it's still there. And as long as anyone looks up at the stars and remembers what they meant to their ancestors, as long as anyone feels that connection to the cosmos, the star knowledge of Native American peoples continues, adapted to new times, but carrying forward something ancient and precious, the understanding that we are not separate from the stars, but part of them, and they are part of us, as they have been since the beginning of time.